Hey, we're going to explore the authentic Wild West tonight. Not the gallant cowboys and spectacular scenes of the Hollywood version. Confrontations, but the harsh, perilous world where one's survival was never certain. You may believe that you're tough, sufficient to manage it, but believe me, they gave it the moniker wild for a reason. If you find these stories entertaining, would be very appreciated if you could quickly like or even subscribe. You won't realize how much it helps. Where are you all listening from? I often wonder. Please leave a remark stating where you are and what time it is there. I love how these stories bring our little international community together. Dim the lights now and perhaps turn on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. And let's take it slow as we embark on our journey together tonight. We'll investigate why you might not make it through a day on the wild American frontier. Well done. You just woke up in the 1870s American Wild West. The good news is that you will soon have the opportunity to see a historic period firsthand. The unfortunate news is that your odds of surviving simply fell sharply. Before you even open your eyes, you are faced with the first challenge. The smell, not the typical earthy, pleasant scent of nature, but something more stronger. The smell of animal feces, unwashed people, and what could. It might be raw sewage that is dangling in midair. You see, in the Wild West, taking a bath wasn't exactly a top concern. The majority of, to be generous, settlers thought that a complete wash was a monthly luxury. Some spent whole winters without a good bath. You see, water was valuable here, and using it too. When you needed it for cooking and drinking, cleaning yourself felt wasteful. As you drag yourself out of bed, which is probably simply a mattress covered in straw and infested with bed bugs, you become aware of how you feel pain in every muscle in your body. Frontier life in the 1870s involved ongoing physical work from sunrise to sunset. There were no vacations, no weekends off, and most definitely no ergonomic factors to take into account. Your body served as your main tool whether you were a ranch laborer, miner, or farmer until it collapsed. You may believe that you put in a lot of effort in your modern life, but frontier labor was a completely different matter. Even the strongest folks were perpetually slumped over from the back-breaking task they did. By their 30s, arthritic. Consider spending 14 hours transporting water, plow fields, working in a mine half deep underground, or cutting timber. It makes sense since the average lifetime was only around 35 years. You feel the coldness of the air as you stand on the dusty floor. If it's in the winter, the temperature inside your cabin may drop by 20 degrees. If you owned a hearth, to save valuable fuel, you would have allowed it to burn down overnight. I hope you can locate thermal underwear or central heating in this century. Additionally, if it's summer, prepare to perspire while reading every piece of your own clothes. In the Wild West, it was impossible to avoid the weather. When it comes to apparel, guys usually own perhaps 2 outfits of clothing: cotton shirts that chafed against the skin and rough canvas or denim pants. Women layered their clothing, irrespective of the temperature. Long dresses, petticoats, corsets, and chemises. The soil was dragged in. Everything was ill-fitting, rough, and infrequently washed. The elegant attire you've observed in films from the West. For the average person, pure fiction. Your stomach rumbles. I'm reminding you that breakfast is time. I hope you enjoy coffee, biscuits, and beans, possibly at every meal. The Wild West diet lacked nutrients and was boring. Seasonal indulgences included fresh produce. Since there was no refrigeration, meat, when it was available, was frequently preserved with smoke or salt. Scurvy is a Illness brought on by a lack of vitamin C, which is evident when your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was prevalent among settlers, even though it is easily avoidable with current understanding. Perhaps you would assume that the coffee would at least be excellent. In movies, cowboys always seem to be smoking weed, but the food they feed you is very different from what you'd identify as coffee. Usually cooked to within an inch of its life, it is unbelievably bitter and may contain salt or even crushed eggshells to lessen the harshness. Nevertheless, you drink it without complaining because the caffeine will help you get through the day. Before you go outdoors, you might want to look for snakes or scorpions on your shoes that might have sock cover during the evening. Frontier people frequently shook out their boots in the morning, a practice that originated from the experience. You can be kilometers from any medical assistance and face a poisonous bite if you make one mistake. Venturing beyond your cabin, you realize at a way how vulnerable you are. The expansive terrain of, while the American frontier was brutal, it was also gorgeous. Severe weather might strike without much notice. Drought, flash floods, tornadoes, and blizzards could all be fatal. For those who are not ready, even though the sky is clear right now, it could change in a matter of minutes. If you've made your home on a frontier town, you may believe that civilization provides some security. That is accurate in certain respects. In others, it just displays various threats. In the Wild West, towns were rife with illness, without adequate sewage systems or knowledge. According to the germ theory, diseases spread quickly throughout societies. Typhoid, cholera, threats from tuberculosis, smallpox, and diphtheria were ever present. A pandemic might destroy out a half town in a few weeks. In relation to towns, suppose you choose to go to one today. As you approach, you observe that the expected orderly arrangement is noticeably absent. Numerous communities in the West expanded hastily, with structures built wherever it is most practical, frequently without adequate infrastructure or planning. Instead of being paved, streets are made of dirt tracks that turn into dust bowls in the rain and mud pits in the sunshine. Dry, the odor reaches you more strongly this time. Horse excrement is already present everywhere due to the primary means of transportation are horses. Sanitation departments and street cleaners do not exist. In certain towns, in places that see a lot of traffic, the collected waste may be knee-deep. A swarm of flies around you, and you see why illness is so prevalent here. You pass the saloon as you proceed down the main street, probably one of the town's busiest places. In contrast to the beautiful portrayals in Hollywood, saloons weren't. Locations with piano players and swinging doors. One room, most of them crude. Affairs with simple furniture and wooden timber bars. The alcohol wasn't good. Raw alcohol that is frequently combined with tobacco juice. Whiskey that is aged in wood barrels. For more kick, add pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder. One drink could. If you were unlucky, it would blind you. Another lethal feature is the saloon of brutality and frontier life. These businesses were usually the locations of fatal encounters that escalated due to intoxicated discussions rather than formal duels or showdowns. Swiftly in a civilization with many weapons, Western films' idealized depictions of gunfights were uncommon. The majority of violence was impulsive, untidy, and motivated by unimportant issues. Speaking of carrying a weapon, you'll note that practically everyone does, though not for the reasons you might think. Consider, although personal safety was undoubtedly important, firearms were mainly used for hunting and defense, from animals, and occasionally for communication. The ongoing danger of cougars, wolves, bears, and poisonous. Going unarmed was foolish because of snakes, especially while moving between communities. It may surprise you to hear that there were stringent gun control regulations in many frontier communities. Locations such as Dodge. Visitors approaching the municipal limits of Tombstone, Arizona, and City, Kansas, were compelled to turn in their firearms. The infamous gunfight at the OK Corral began as a result of the Clanton gang disregarded the firearms ordinance in Tombstone. In contrast to what you've seen in films, it was very uncommon to find quick-draw jewels in the middle of the road. The majority of shootings occurred during ambushes or throughout robberies. The idea of a proficient marksman battling an adversary at midday is mostly a Hollywood creation. Actual frontier violence was usually abrupt, disorderly, and devoid of any sense of justice or honor. As you proceed with you pass the neighborhood doctor's office on your walk. You'd be appalled at the medical treatment on the frontier in the 1870s. The majority of physicians lacked formal training, if any. The only anesthesia used for surgical procedures was whiskey, or sterilization was almost non-existent, as was morphine. Something as basic as an infected cut may result in death or amputation. Typical therapies included bloodletting, arsenic, mercury compounds, and other harmful chemicals that frequently did more harm than good. The mortality rate for women giving delivery was as high as 1 in 4 in isolated places. In dentistry, extraction was done without anesthetic using primitive implements. The majority of people had excruciating oral problems for years prior to losing their teeth at last. If you suffered an illness or injury while on the frontier, frequently, luck played a bigger role in your survival than medical assistance. Even small wounds could be fatal because of infection. Frontier people may experience persistent pain as a result of broken bones that never fully heal, as well as disabilities. The well-known adage, "Only the strong survive," actually meant the Wild West. You know it's time for lunch when your stomach rumbles once again. You visit the neighborhood eatery, which is probably simply a restaurant that serves food for a price and is probably just an extension of someone's house. The variety of the cuisine is no greater than that of your breakfast. Meat is hard and frequently goes bad, in spite of excessive smoking or salting, and any available vegetables are overcooked until they are mushy. There are no standards for food safety. Thus, dissension and food poisoning happens frequently. Or you listen in on discussions about recent Indian assaults, illegal gang activity, or the peril of traveling alone. Although Native American, contrary to popular culture, violence against settlers was much less frequent. In fact, settlers in the U.S., the likelihood of the military being the aggressors was much higher. There was still fighting on the boundary. The methodical tensions resulting from the relocation of indigenous peoples occasionally turned violent on both sides. Outlaws posed a real menace, especially in isolated areas. Regions. There was little law enforcement, with only one sheriff occasionally in charge of miles and square miles. In numerous locations, vigilante action was used to administer justice instead of formal court cases. Lynch mobs were widespread, and the idea that someone is innocent until proven guilty frequently wasn't relevant. If you were charged with stealing horses or rustling cattle, you might end up dangling from a tree before the sun sets. Whatever your true, whether you are guilty or innocent, you choose to go to the neighborhood general store after lunch to accumulate supplies. You are shocked by the prices. Basic needs are very expensive. Due to the cost and complexity of transportation, more on the frontier than in the East. A basic peach can might be as much as $20 in today's currency. A lot of settlers spent the majority of their income on necessities, leaving little for pleasure or comfort. The shop provides an additional look into the loneliness of the frontier. Delivery of mail was irregular and untrustworthy. Newspapers may be outdated by a few weeks or months. Data was transmitted slowly, and you may not hear from your family in the East for years. Many settlers never again saw their family members. After heading west, the psychological effects of this seclusion led to elevated prevalences of alcoholism, depression, and suicide among people living on the frontier. Later in the afternoon, dark clouds are beginning to form on the horizon. The frontier's weather wasn't. It might be fatal, but it's simply uncomfortable. Storms came without much notice in the absence of modern forecasting. The blizzards can leave passengers stranded and cause cold deaths. Tornadoes ruined whole towns without any emergency services to help survivors. A flash. Wagon trains were washed away by floodwaters. Droughts destroyed crops and led to famine. It offered little protection if you were fortunate enough to have a decent home. The majority of homes on the boundary were hurriedly put together using whatever components were on hand. Log homes in forests and sod dwellings on the plains. Areas or modest wooden buildings in cities. None worked very well against severe weather conditions. Indoor winter temperatures may fall below freezing. The summer heat was frequently intolerable, particularly in upper levels or attics where a lot of people slept. When the storm gets closer, you choose to, before it hits, return to your cabin. You pass a group of workers on their way to work at the nearby mine. One of the most deadly occupations on the frontier was mining. Explosions, exposure to hazardous gases, and underground cave-ins. Numerous fatalities were caused by industrial mishaps and incorrectly handled blasting powder. Miners also suffered from chronic illnesses such as mercury poisoning from gold processing or black lung from coal dust. Even if few jobs on the frontier were safe and mining was avoided. Farming was risky, equipment lacking any safety precautions. Working on a ranch required dealing with erratic creatures that weighed hundreds in pounds. Of all occupations, logging has one of the highest death rates. Anything you did to create a life, your chances of suffering a major injury or passing away were tenfold greater than they are now. You return to your cabin right before the rain starts. There are multiple leaks in the roof, so you set up buckets to collect the water. Refilling your drinking water is a smart idea right now. Since clean water was valuable and in short supply, many waterborne illnesses resulted from frontier people drinking from the same sources that were used to wash and water livestock. Diseases that could be lethal very rapidly. Sitting in your wet hut, you listen to. You consider how reality differs from the idealized portrayal of the Wild West as you listen to the rain. There were only people fighting to survive in extremely difficult circumstances, no heroes or villains. The reality that anyone survived is evidence of the tenacity and will of people. It gets dark early since you don't have electricity. You be cautious when using oil lamps and candles since they only produce a little illumination. There was always fire, peril in residences on the frontier. One spark could result in the loss of everything without any fire department to request assistance. At least one settlement was destroyed by fire. In their past, you get ready for bed after spending only one day in the Wild West. Your stomach is upset from the strange food, your muscles hurt, and the constant vigilance needed to survive overwhelms your thoughts. As you go to sleep, You question whether you'll survive tomorrow or if you'll end up as just another statistic in the perilous tale of America's frontier. You can hear the wind howling outside. Cabin, a somber reminder of how helpless and little people are in comparison to the expanse of the wild landscape. If you're fortunate enough to see it, tomorrow will present all of these difficulties once more in addition to some you haven't yet encountered, but envisioned. Survival was never assured in the Wild West. The day was earned, enduring adversity day by day and hour by hour. The majority of modern people can hardly understand. You awaken from a restless slumber as the dawn light seeps through the crevices in your cabin walls. The rough mattress is giving me bodily aches, but I don't have time to dwell. The Wild West doesn't wait for anyone. As you get up, you reflect on the difficult beginning to frontier life yesterday and consider what new. There will be difficulties today. Suppose you choose to travel today and leave town. Over the border, whether you're traveling west on a wagon train, going to another community, or just exploring. The experience of traveling in the 1870s was completely different from what you are accustomed to. Fortunately, by doing this, by this point, the Transcontinental Railroad had been finished, linking America's east and west coastlines. The bad news is that you most likely couldn't afford to utilize it unless you were going between large cities or were relatively rich. The majority of people on the frontier moved on foot, in wagons, or on horseback. If you were a horse owner, think of yourself lucky. The cost of purchasing and caring for horses was high, placing them out of many settlers' grasp. A quality horse could cost as much as several months' salary. Then you required feed, bridles, saddles, and veterinary treatment. Even though veterinary care frequently meant riding was not enjoyable, and if the animal broke a leg or became ill, it was shot. Take a cruise. In the 1870s, saddles were made for purposes rather than for comfort. Even seasoned riders developed blisters and sore muscles after hours spent in the saddle. Additionally, if your horse, frightened by a snake or a loud noise, which was common, you could be flung and possibly hurt. Miles away from any assistance or worse, fractured bones. If a horse was out of your price range, you could take a wagon ride. Put aside the idyllic vision of pioneers joyfully rolling across immaculate prairies. Wagon. It was quite uncomfortable to travel. Other from the minor give in the wooden wheels, the vehicles lacked a suspension mechanism, indicating that every rock, rut, and hole on the trail was felt. The jarring that never stops generated seasickness like wagon sickness, which made travelers queasy and sad. If there were roads at all, they were mostly only dirt roads, carved by earlier visitors. They turned into muddy quagmires after the rain, where we might sink axle deep. When it was dry, the dust was so dense that you could hardly see or breathe. Wagons often broke down due to axles or cracked wheels, snapping miles away from the closest community. Suppose you've made the decision to travel all the way to California or Oregon. On the well-known Oregon Trail, you have joined a wagon train traveling west. This 2,000-mile trip was among the most dangerous endeavors of the 1800s. Out of the roughly 400,000, an estimated 1 in 10 persons tried it between the 1840s and 1860s, failed to survive. Some people referred to the Oregon Trail as the longest in the country. Cemetery. According to some historians, 10 to 15 people perished on average because each and every mile of the path. Consider that. A burial approximately every 350 feet for 2,000 meters. There were stone markers and improvised crosses along the trail. Families were compelled to bury loved ones and move on, leaving many without names. Their trip. The leading cause of death along the Oregon Trail was disease. Cholera, a bacterial infection that was spread by tainted water, proved very destructive. This terrible disease induced vomiting and severe diarrhea, rapidly depleting bodily fluids so that a person could remain healthy. Dead by dinner and at breakfast. The available treatment was ineffective. Occasionally, wagon trains may lose dozens of individuals in a single outbreak of cholera. Other illnesses such as typhoid, dysentery, and many people died from mountain fever. Children were particularly at risk since so many families were losing several kids on the trip. At best, medical treatment was crude and frequently involved using traditional cures that accomplished little to improve the situation and occasionally made it worse. Getting across rivers offered yet another lethal obstacle. Pioneers had to cross many rivers with wagons that weren't made to float. Their westward trek. While some had fords or ferries, many needed the wagon to be like an improvised watercraft. It drifted across. Often, wagons overturned in these crossings, killing cattle and people and destroying valuable supplies. During the migration period, hundreds of people died in Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers. In contrast to popular Native American attacks were thought to be comparatively uncommon. The majority of tribes were really beneficial to migrants, providing supplies, advice, and support with river crossings. Accidents were the primary cause of violent deaths on the trail, being kicked by draft animals, drowned, or crushed by wagon wheels. Accidents involving firearms were surprisingly frequent since most passengers had familiarity with them, although they carried them for protection and hunting. The journey's psychological cost was enormous. Along the route, families buried their husbands, parents, and children before having to immediately resume their journey. On the route, there was no time for prolonged mourning. There was less likelihood of traversing the mountains before each day's postponement. Passes were impossible due to winter snows. The ongoing anxiety, sadness, and physical. Many tourists experienced mental breakdowns as a result of suffering. Suicide was not unusual amongst trail migrants. If you managed to make it to Oregon or California, the difficulties had not ended. Many reached their goal after devoting all of their funds and resources to the trip itself. Families frequently arrived sick, hungry, and impoverished just to discover the hard realities of the promised country. However, suppose you've made a decision not to make the trip that far. Instead, you might be traveling to a nearby town or community. Even brief excursions in the wild. The West posed serious risks. Outlaws who view lone motorcyclists or small groups as easy targets may come across travelers. Targets. Although later literature inflated the frequency of stagecoach robberies, they did happen frequently enough to have merit as a problem. Travelers were always at risk from the natural environment. A flash. Floods could capture careless travelers or wash off pathways. Desert summer heat. Heat stroke and dehydration could be fatal in some areas. Travelers were frequently stranded by winter blizzards, occasionally, resulting in freezing deaths or dire circumstances, such as the notorious Donna Party, where survivors turned to cannibalism in order to survive. In a time before comprehensive maps, navigation was difficult in and of itself. Passengers depended on imprecise instructions, potentially ambiguous landmarks, and the knowledge of advisors who weren't always trustworthy. It could be fatal to become lost in the wilderness, particularly if the supply ran out. You observe another facet of the frontier as you go today. Life that is rarely faithfully portrayed in films. The breathtaking variety of individuals. White cowboys and settlers were not the only people living in the Wild West. It was a place where cultures from all around the world came together. Chinese immigrants were employed as miners, railroad construction, and traders. Long before the Southwest became a part of the United States, Mexican families were residing there. Black cowboys produced up to 25% of the labor force on certain ranches. Immigrants from Europe, Scandinavia, Italy, Germany, and Ireland all contributed their customs and civilizations. A fact, there are dozens of different native. Before outsiders came, American nations had inhabited these territories for thousands of years. However, this diversity didn't imply harmony or equality. A prevalent aspect of frontier life was racial violence. Chinese railroad employees endured severe prejudice and were frequently compelled to accept the riskiest jobs at lower wages than white employees. Landowners in Mexico regularly had their property taken by theft or legal wrangling during the Mexican-American War. In an attempt to flee the South, Black Americans relocated west. Discrimination frequently revealed frontier racism to be equally, if not more, ingrained in form, even though they played a vital role in mining, ranching, and establishing frontier settlements. They are shut out of social acceptance and economic opportunity. 4. The growth of white settlement was absolutely disastrous for Native Americans. The native populace of North America, which formerly had a population of maybe 15 million, had been diminished to, by 1900, there were less than 300,000. Illness, conflict, evictions, and the many tribes and civilizations were wiped out as a result of the intentional destruction of their food supply, especially the buffalo. Native Americans were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and placed on reservations by U.S. government policy, frequently in places with little resources and poor soil. Treaties were frequently shattered upon the discovery of significant resources on reservations. Native children had been removed from their homes, being sent to boarding schools that were founded on the idea of killing people in order to eradicate their cultural identity. Save the man, Indian, the idealized contrast between Indians and cowboys. Later movie narratives wildly exaggerated the intricate relationships between native populations and settlers. At first, many indigenous nations attempted to make room for newcomers and adjust to evolving situations. Usually, violence broke out as a result of intentional provocations, encroachment on tribal territories, or persistent treaty violations. As you proceed, you consider another group whose experiences were very different from those portrayed in Hollywood. Frontier women. Frontier women, as opposed to the defenseless damsels or school mothers of Western films, performed physically taxing work while negotiating socially constraining anticipations. Women performed a variety of conventional household tasks on homesteads and farms, including cooking, cleaning, childcare, and textile production, but also labored in the fields, cared for animals, and protected the house when essential. Usually, their workday began before sunrise and ended well after, gloomy with little to no sleep. It may be necessary for a frontier lady to plow fields, deliver a neighbor's infant around noon, fend off predators endangering the livestock in the afternoon, while continuing to cook and look after her own kids. Many ladies became young widows as a result of the perilous nature of life on the frontier and had to raise children while running farms or enterprises by themselves. Despite their vital achievements, women's legal rights were limited. In the majority of regions, in states, they were not allowed to vote, independently own property if they were married, or be granted custody of their children in the case of a divorce. Victims of domestic abuse have few legal options because it was viewed as a private problem. 4. Women without spouses had very few options. Despite being a female occupation, teaching was one of the few respected occupations. Teachers were expected to quit after getting married and were paid much less than their male counterparts. Some women become financially independent by operating boarding homes, becoming nurses, starting millinery or companies that make dresses. Then came the soiled doves, who were prostitutes employed in saloons and brothels in the border. Later mythology, however, idealized these. The reality was usually bleak for women. Many widowed people who were in financial need entered the field, or deserted. Venereal disease, drug addiction, and physical abuse were frequent risks associated with the job. Even those who succeeded in making a lot of money were shunned by society and unable to move on to more respectable positions. On the frontier, some women did enjoy more independence than they might have back home. East, they had more alternatives for marriage and occasionally better treatment because there were fewer women in Western areas, as localities fought to draw and retain female inhabitants. A few regions, decades before the 19th Amendment, states like Wyoming and Utah gave women the right to vote, acknowledging their crucial contributed to the development of the frontier. As the day goes on and you keep going, while traveling, you may be concerned about the presence of law enforcement in this ostensibly lawless country. The reality was multifaceted and intricate, extensively by place. Organized law enforcement was usually present in major cities and villages, although huge. There was little to no official protection in rural areas. Elected individuals known as county sheriffs were in charge of preserving law and order over sometimes vast areas. Just one sheriff, maybe thousands of square kilometers without any law enforcement, making routine patrols impractical. They were dependent mostly on using regular people as stand-ins in emergency situations, setting up posies to hunt out criminals or deal with violence. Law enforcement was conducted by town marshals. Enforcement inside town bounds, occasionally in bigger villages with a few deputies. These roles were frequently hazardous and low-paying, drawing a combination of devoted public employees and individuals who took pleasure in the authority the insignia offered. Some well-known attorneys, such as Wyatt Herb, alternated between respectable police enforcement and dubious businesses during their professions. Although they were few in number, federal marshals held jurisdiction over states and territories. They usually concentrated on serious crimes like mail robbery, counterfeiting, or acts involving several jurisdictions. The renowned U.S. Marshals of Western films, acting alone, establishing law in lawless communities, were mostly made up. In isolated places, informal community action was used to administer justice instead of conventional legal procedures. Watchdog. When official law enforcement was lacking or ineffectual, groups were established to handle perceived threats. Occasionally although groups upheld fundamental order, they might quickly turn into platforms for bigotry, personal grudges, or mob aggression. The quick-draw gunfight's famous picture was mostly a later innovation. The majority of frontier violence was commonplace, impetuous, and frequently driven by alcohol, domestic violence, bar fights that turned deadly, and Dramatic shootouts on dusty streets were far less common than conflicts over land or animals. The penalty for crimes was severe by today's standards. The usual punishment for rape, murder, and even theft, especially of cattle or horses. There were prisons, but were rudimentary establishments with high rates of illness, violence, and substandard living conditions. Numerous communities favored instantaneous execution over lengthy incarceration. As dusk draws near, you make the decision to spend the night somewhere. With luck, you may come to a town with a hotel or boarding home. Expect nothing luxuriant. At best, the accommodations on the frontier were simple. In a normal hotel room, there would be a basic bed that can be bed bug infested, a washstand with a pitcher and maybe a chair and a basin. There would be a shared restroom in the back for everyone to use. Visitors. There was little privacy because the walls were weak and you could hear your neighbors in every action and discussion. In more crowded places, you may even have to share a bed with a unfamiliar, a standard procedure to increase capacity during peak times. The linens may not have been altered for earlier visitors, and only oil lamps or candles would be used for lighting. A night's accommodation would range from 25 cents to $1, depending on the location and caliber of the institution. This served as a substantial cost for many tourists, equal to several hours' pay for a typical worker. Many choose to sleep in. Despite the extra risks, you can save money by staying in stables, barns, or just outside. Displayed. You would probably spend the night camping if you were going through more isolated locations. This required starting a fire, sleeping on the dirt, cooking with what little you have, and hoping to locate enough fuel. Very little defense against wildlife or the weather. Native Americans, seasoned tourists, and military scouts had developed advanced camping safety methods. However, the typical settler frequently made risky errors. Managing the fire effectively literally meant the difference between life and death. An excessively huge fire could cause a forest fire or prairie fire that could burn thousands of acres in a few of hours. A too small one could not offer enough warmth during chilly evenings, resulting in hypothermia. Cooking over a campfire is necessary. The majority of modern people lack these abilities, which frequently leads to meals that roar and burn at the same time. As dark, the noises of the border darkness envelop you as you are ready to go to sleep. Howling coyotes in the separation. Birds that are unfamiliar call. Through trees or grass, the breeze murmurs. For those used to the bright lights and cacophony of modern life, the deep shadows and peculiar noises of wilderness evenings frequently caused severe worry. Many tourists had trouble sleeping on the frontier, not just due to discomfort on a physical level, but also because of concern about potential threats that could. The shadows. Although they were uncommon, native attacks frequently happened at dawn, when sleepers were most susceptible. Mountain lions, bears, and wolves are among the predators that may look into camps. Searching for food. Scorpions and poisonous snakes looked for warm spots to relax, occasionally incorporating a bedroll for a sleeper, even if there are no real dangers. Came to pass, the mental strain of being on guard took its toll. Frontier journals often make reference to fatigue brought on by the mental pressure of constant attentiveness, as well as physical labor. Contemporary individuals. People used to locks, alarms, and the safety of a crowded area would discover. The precariousness of sleeping arrangements in the frontier is really unsettling. As you fall off to sleep, you consider the events of the day. Journeying in the wild West hardly resembles its idealized, sanitized representation in later amusement. It was more difficult, risky, and uncomfortable than most contemporary individuals could handle. The Mustin's abilities range from mapless navigation to it took years to create safe emergency handgun handling procedures, and errors were frequently lethal. As the darkness grows, the noise of night creatures increases. There will be fresh problems tomorrow. Maybe if you make it through the night, you'll arrive at where you're going. Or you can end up becoming just another unmarked burial on the path. Another figure in the dangerous tale of westward migration. No weakness was tolerated in the Wild West, and gave no second chances. Surviving each day was a triumph over insurmountable obstacles. A fresh day begins. The boundary, and you've made it through the night somehow. An accomplishment unto itself in the Wild West. While you massage the slumber from your eyes and ease your sore limbs, you wonder where your frontier adventure would lead you. Maybe you'll try your luck in one of the bustling mining towns today, where people claim to make millions overnight. You've heard tales of the Colorado mining booms, the Nevada silver strikes, and the California gold rush. Stories of the discovery of chicken egg-sized nuggets that allow regular folks to become rich overnight has attracted hundreds of thousands to the West. The harsh realities that await people who pursue mineral are not mentioned in these tales. Dreams. Suppose you choose to give mining a go. What would that really be? Comprise? Finding unclaimed land with possible mineral reserves is the first step in staking a claim. By the 1870s, it had become more challenging because the wealthiest and simplest locations were asserted years prior. If you were fortunate enough to locate a suitable location, you would have to file a claim at locate the closest government office and pay the necessary fees, which may be high. The actual work would then start. Additionally, it was some of the most physically taxing work that a placer could do. Mining. Looking in streams for loose gold. You would be hunched over for hours using a pan or sleeve box to filter through particles in icy alpine water. Your constant contact with water and harsh surfaces would cause hands to bleed and fracture. Your back might hurt because of the stooped posture. You'd be lucky to locate a few tiny particles of gold worth pennies after all that work. If the risks increased when you started hard rock mining and dug for or veins in the highlands. Exponentially, digging into shaky rock without the use of contemporary safety gear or engineering expertise resulted in many miners who were crushed where they stood by cave-ins. Shafts with inadequate ventilation filled. Involves miners being suffocated by poisonous fumes like carbon monoxide, which are odorless but lethal, who were unaware of the threat. Using dynamite or black powder blasting. It was extremely risky to break through rock. Miners often lost their hands, fingers, eyes, or even their lives when charges exploded too soon, or flung pieces of rock turned into lethal missiles. The roaring sound and many people suffered permanent hearing loss as a result of the continuous blasting pounding. Even if you managed to escape the immediate disasters, the long-term health consequences were disastrous. Miners continuously breathed in silicosis, a painful lung illness that eventually suffocates its victims, is caused by tiny rock dust. Mercury is utilized in gold processing, resulted in tremors, mental health issues, and neurological damage. Degradation. Workers in lead or copper mines were exposed to harmful elements that accumulated in their bodies, leading to early mortality and chronic sickness. In the 1870s, the mining industry had almost no safety rules or error. Profit was more important to mine owners than the welfare of their employees, and accidents were accepted as a normal part of the work. Injured miners received little and frequently useless medical attention. And important, without workers' compensation or disability benefits, an injury usually meant the end of a miner's career and means of subsistence. Available compensation. Given all of these dangers and difficulties, what was the most likely reward? The great majority of miners made barely enough to survive, notwithstanding the notion of the fortunate prospector. By the 1870s, the majority were employed by big mining firms instead of working on their own, making 2 toasts, $3 for a demanding 10 to 12-hour day. Research indicates that retail owners, saloon, the miners whose aspirations kept frontier mining communities afloat were constantly outpaid by owners and prostitutes. In relation to mining communities, they were infamously unforgiving. Consider a community made up mostly of young, unmarried men working in hazardous jobs, lacking families, civilizing institutions, and women. Drinking alcohol was celestial. Compared to the average American today, the average resident of a mining camp drank alcohol several times more frequently. There was a lot of violence, with regular shootings, stabbings, and fights. In mining camps, there was usually little infrastructure and poor sanitation. Garbage and human waste gathered in rivers and streets. Cholera, typhoid, and dissension increased quickly under these circumstances. The stink may be overpowering during the summer months, and swarms of flies can transmit disease from food waste. If you were successful in discovering precious mineral, you had to deal with the difficulty of turning it into money. In the Wild West, banking was archaic and frequently predatory. Numerous mining communities lacked banks at all, making miners susceptible for theft by requiring them to carry ore, dust, or gold. A few bars in general. Businesses took advantage of miners by offering to buy gold, often at prices much lower than its true value. Restricted choices. When banks were present, they were either not heavily regulated or error. Bank failures were frequent and frequently destroyed consumers' life savings. Without prior notice or recourse, a large number of bankers were merely confidence men who created stores, took deposits, and vanished the next day with all the money. Individual banks issued paper money in the absence of nationally backed currency, and its value varied greatly based on the bank's standing. Fake invoices circulated extensively, and skilled traders may be duped by well-made fakes. Although gold or silver coins were the safest form of payment, carrying them made one a robbery target. Maybe after weighing the risks and setbacks of mining, you choose to instead try your hand at ranching. In the 1870s, the cattle industry was flourishing. Opportunities are being created on the frontier by the demand for beef in eastern towns. This would undoubtedly be a more wholesome, more profitable business endeavor. Indeed, ranching helped people escape some of the worst health risks of mining, but it brought with it special risks and difficulties. Commencing a ranch needed a large amount of money. Buildings, equipment, animals, and land all constituted significant investments. Many would-be ranchers incurred significant debt in order to buy these essentials, placing their future bets on favorable market and weather circumstances. Nature frequently has other ideas. Grazing may wither due to droughts. Lands and deplete vital water supplies, requiring ranchers to either keep an eye on their cattle, die from starvation, or suffer terrible losses when sold. Severe winters might wipe out whole herds, as was the case during the notorious Great Die-Up in 1886 to 1887, when as much as 90% of Cattle in northern ranges either starved to death or froze amid exceptionally harsh the weather. A rancher's investment could be destroyed if disease spreads among herds. All night. In the 1870s, there were no reliable cures for infectious diseases, including anthrax, Texas fever, and others. Livestock was often harmed by predators like wolves and cougars, especially weak calves. Quicksand, poisonous plants, and injuries also decreased. Herds. Cattle drives are famous for transporting herds hundreds of miles to railroads. Shipping points were hard, perilous endeavors rather than romantic getaways. Not the glitzy cowboys, people from later movies, but usually young, low-wage workers who put in 20 hours a day on the road and caught fleeting. As they traversed challenging terrain with thousands of animals, they took naps in the saddle. These drives encountered ongoing dangers. If animals panicked, river crossings might quickly become lethal, resulting in drowning pileups. Both cows and cowmen. Stampedes could be set off by anything as basic as a lightning strike or a thousands of 1,500-pound beasts into an unstoppable force by breaking a twig. Devastating power. During stampedes, cowboys were frequently crushed to death. The freedom depicted in Western mythology was not at all like the cowboy's existence. Usually, they made around $30 each month for demanding, risky labor. The majority were young males. Teenagers from low-income families frequently have few alternative choices. Black, Mexican, or mixed-race people made up a sizable portion. Persons whose possibilities elsewhere were restricted due to discrimination. They mostly ate beans, salt pork, and biscuits while on the path. Very little fresh food. The trail cook's knowledge of folk cures was the extent of medical care. Damage frequently went untreated until they became life-threatening in such hazardous jobs. Numerous cowboys lost their lives. Young because to trauma, exposure, or aggression. Maybe ranching isn't all that appealing. How about farming? The most basic of human endeavors, raising food, would undoubtedly provide a more secure and less hazardous. The frontier way of life? The 1862 Homestead Act had made a huge regions of the West for habitation, providing 160 acres at no cost to anyone who would occupy the site and make improvements for 5 years. This appeared to be an amazing opportunity, a chance for low-income individuals to own property and establish independent livelihoods. The promise turned out to be much easier than the reality. Initially, 160 acres may seem like a lot, but in the arid areas that made up a large portion of the land that was available, it was frequently not enough to sustain a family. Traditional farming practices in the East failed in these conditions when the amount of rainfall was far less than what the pioneers were used to. A large number of settlers had no understanding of the dry farming methods required to succeed in these areas. It took a lot of physical work to start a frontier farm. The first duty was to construct a shelter, usually the sod home was built by cutting and stacking thick prairie turf on the treeless plains. These sods were dark, wet homes that soaked when it rained, were home to snakes and insects, and fell apart without regular upkeep. After that, the labor-intensive task of preparing the ground for planting began. The deep grass roots that had grown over generations held the prairie sod together. It was extremely challenging to plow using the tools that the majority of settlers had at their disposal. It can require a year or longer. Need to get a few acres ready for planting. The physical demands of the occupation caused lifelong damage. Several bodies of farmers. Following the planting of crops, farmers were threatened by, in all directions, plants may wither due to drought before being harvested. Torrential rains may flood or sweep away seedlings. Fields. Crops could be killed by early frost right before harvest. Biblical swarms of grasshoppers descended and began eating. Everything in their path is green, and occasionally they even devour the tool handles that are left in. Fields. Like everyone else, frontier farmers were impacted by disease, but with especially devastating consequences. With minimal community support and no professional assistance of families. A disease that strikes during critical planting or harvesting times could mean the difference between famine. Women frequently kept laboring in the fields despite being heavily, putting their health at risk when pregnant or shortly after giving delivery, as the work just couldn't wait. Farm mishaps were frequent and frequently lethal. Injuries resulted from homemade instruments breaking. In a panic, the animals stomped on their handlers. Even harvests that are successful might become lethal. Many farmers perished after suffocating in the loose grain after falling into grain storage bins, or when shoddy storage structures gave way under the weight of their belongings. The seclusion of. There was a significant psychological cost to frontier farmers. Neighbors may live far away and receive little visits. This solitude was especially detrimental to women. There are those who go months without talking to anyone outside of their close relatives. Many settlers suffered from depression, anxiety, and what was once known as prairie madness, occasionally, either in suicide or homestead abandonment. For those who persisted, despite these difficulties and the actual production of crops, financial barriers persisted. Market transportation was challenging and costly. Perishable goods had to be preserved or sold fast without refrigeration. Big railroads and agricultural firms utilized their clout to keep transportation costs and produce prices low, high, putting pressure on independent farmers from both sides. By the 1870s, an additional option was arising on the frontier, laboring for pay in the expanding industries and communities. Maybe this provided a safer, more reliable route than the hazardous occupations of livestock, mining, or cultivating. Some of the harshest financial and physical risks were avoided by wage work. Hazards of autonomous businesses, but it also brought with it its own set of difficulties. Industrial. There were essentially no safety regulations in place. Workers endured hardships in frontier mills, factories, and workshops. Horrific wounds from unsecured equipment. Building crews constructed ever taller buildings without harnesses or safety gear, which frequently results in catastrophic falls. Railroad labor was especially hazardous. Track layers endured harsh working conditions with little equipment, including high rates of exhaustion, heat stroke, and accident-related injuries and fatalities. Chinese laborers that constructed a large portion of the transcontinental. The riskiest jobs, including handling unstable explosives to blow through, were frequently given to railroad workers. Mountain ranges. By today's standards, working hours were lengthy, usually lasting 10 to 12 hours. Daily, 6 days a week. Most employees made very little money due to the poor pay. Wages sufficient for subsistence. Children as young as 8 or 9 years old frequently worked alongside adults in numerous industries, which frequently have worse injury rates because of their scale and lack of experience. There were virtually no legal protections for workers. People could be fired by their employers without justification, unfairly cut salaries, or completely refused to pay. Individuals who blacklisting occurred when someone protested or tried to organize for improved conditions. They were labeled as troublemakers who didn't. There would be other employers in the area, companies, towns, communities where a In areas known for mining and lumber, it was typical for all enterprises and housing to be owned by a single employer. Employees in these communities lived in corporate homes, paid exorbitant prices at company stores, and occasionally received compensation in script, business money instead of legal tender. This produced a type of employees in debt bondage were never able to save enough money to leave the system. Whether you worked for pay, mined, ranched, or farmed, frontier life influenced your experiences in ways that would be confusing to folks in the present world. Maybe the majority, not the meticulously recorded minutes and hours of our digital age, but a more remarkable relationship with time. Dynamic world controlled by the seasons, daylight, and the cycles of nature. With electric lights, the majority of people went to bed soon after nightfall and woke up at dawn. Their hours of operation are growing and contracting as the seasons change. The tasks that needed to be completed were used to quantify work rather than 8-hour shifts. Fields removed, plowed, or livestock moved. People may labor from first light until long after harvest or roundup, dark for weeks at a time. Many agricultural workers experienced periods of relative inactivity throughout the winter when crops were dormant. Cattle that were dormant need very little care. The idea of timeliness, so essential to contemporary life, but had little use on the frontier. Few clocks and little requirement for exact. People followed rough schedules for the majority of activities. Later trains and stagecoaches brought more exact timings westward. However, outside of these particular settings, morning or, for the most part, the time designations following dinner were appropriately precise. Recreation and amusement. They didn't resemble their contemporary equivalents at all. Following long workdays, the majority of frontier people had little energy for intricate tasks. Simple card games, storytelling, or fireside chatter were typical nighttime activities. When there were instruments and talented musicians with fiddles, music was popular. Guitars and harmonas are used to accompany social dances. Reading material was valuable and frequently distributed throughout whole towns. One book might be read out loud during neighborhood get-togethers or transferred from one family to another until it broke down due to usage. Newspapers, when accessible, were read several times, and each notification and advertisement was carefully examined for details regarding the larger world. There were organized sports, but they were less complex than they are now. Baseball was becoming more and more popular, played on improvised fields with very little equipment. Wrestling, horse racing, and shooting contests offered amusement as well as chances to show off useful abilities. Kids played games with minimal or no equipment requirements. Stickball variations, tag, and hide-and-seek could be played with items that were found. Community festivals and holidays became increasingly significant as uncommon chances for leisure and social interaction. 4th of July festivities may attract people for games, dancing, talks, and picnics from far and wide. Harvest festivals signified the successful conclusion of the most important events of the year. Labor. Religious holidays offered welcome respites as well as spiritual significance. Out of habit, as the day comes to an end, you find yourself thinking back on the unrelenting difficulties of life on the frontier. Every element needed more effort, entailed more danger, and provided less amenities than its contemporary counterpart. The survivors, and occasionally, flourished under these circumstances and had traits that are rarely valued in contemporary culture. Outstanding physical endurance, useful abilities that may be used in a variety of situations, and mental toughness in the face of ongoing loss and adversity. Once again, the darkness descends, bringing a deep enough silence to hear your own heartbeat. No air, no automobile engines. Conditioners, no electrical hums. Only the sound of insects, the wind, and the sporadic call of birds of the night. The soundtrack was this deep silence that is so foreign to contemporary ears. Of frontier evenings, occasionally reassuring, occasionally disturbing in its void. You question whether you would have had what it takes to live here for more than a day as you fall asleep, or a week, for decades and years. The individuals who influenced the American West were, for better or worse, complicated people dealing with great challenges rather than the romanticized heroes of later fiction. Difficulties posed by their era's limited resources and knowledge. Without the romance, their narrative is one of human perseverance in the face of circumstances that now would shatter many of us. The crisp night air envelopes you like a blanket, and the stars come out in a dazzling display that is impossible to behold in our contemporary, light-polluted world. Few people nowadays can truly understand the pure beauty that the frontier people enjoyed, like this one at least. The magnificent Milky Way glide across a pitch-black sky, linking them to the same cosmic view that their forefathers had gazed upon for generations. Once more, morning arrives in. Hunger is a constant friend on the frontier, and it comes with the Wild West. 1870s cuisine. The West didn't resemble the diverse, practical diet that you're used to in the contemporary society. Let's examine what it would really mean to keep oneself supplied in this hostile setting. Fortunately, there was still a fair amount of game at numerous locations. You might add deer, elk, rabbits, and other birds to your diet, if you were capable of hunting them. The bad news was that hunting needed ammunition, which could be costly, for defense. Additionally, it required time away from other crucial tasks, which made, during peak seasons, many settlers were unable to afford this luxury. The majority of foods that could be grown, preserved, or bought in bulk were essential to frontier families. The mainstays of the pork, corn, and beans were staples of the frontier diet, rich in calories yet boring, and lacking in nutrients. Only during certain seasons, usually a few months, were fresh fruits and vegetables accessible, and fresh produce was frequently completely absent from winter diets. This deficiency in nutritional diversity resulted in widespread malnutrition, scurvy brought on by vitamin C. When fresh produce was scarce in the winter and early spring, deficiencies were frequent. Gum bleeding, the symptoms. With the resources at hand, it was challenging to prevent the well-known problems of loosening teeth, joint pain, and eventually death. Other diseases with deficiencies impacted children's development and resulted in a number of long-term health issues for adults. The preservation of food was a constant difficulty and essential survival ability. In the absence of refrigeration, meat had to be either eaten right away or preserved by drying, salting, or smoking. These techniques inhibited the growth of microorganisms, although significantly altered textures and flavors while losing nutritional value. The excessive blood pressure and other health problems were caused by the excessive salt content of preserved meals. Women spent a great deal of effort conserving food when it was plentiful for use in rare times. Vegetables were fermented or pickled in vinegar. Fruits were, if available, dry or preserved with sugar. Root veggies may be kept underground in root cellars, areas that kept the temperature cool. These conservation initiatives were vital survival tasks that may decide whether a family would have food not extracurricular pursuits. In the winter, food storage had its own set of issues. Well prepared, although faulty methods resulted in food spoiling and sometimes death, preserved meals may endure months or even years. Poisoning. Furthermore, pests were drawn to food that was preserved. Mice, insects, and rats. 8 sections of the majority of food supplies that were stockpiled, and their excrement tainted the remaining food. The majority of frontier families merely tolerated a certain quantity of mouse feces and insect bits in their beans, flour, and other necessities as they are inevitable. Cooking required a lot more work, more complex than contemporary people may readily understand. The meals were cooked over wood-burning stoves or open hearths that needed fuel and maintenance all the time. Women and children may spend hours collecting dried manure, buffalo chips, or twisted trees in the sparse grassland areas. Grass to use as fuel for cooking. It was necessary to transport water from streams or wells. For drinking, cleaning, and cooking, hundreds of pounds are frequently spent every day. Despite these attempts, meals lacked the diversity and taste characteristics of contemporary. People anticipate. Spices were costly luxury items that were rarely, if ever, used. Coffee and sugar were cherished commodities that were frequently saved for special events. There was only fresh milk available if a cow was owned by the household. Additionally, the cow was only producing for a portion of the year. The majority of frontier kids were raised on monotonous, basic diets that would appall contemporary dietitians. It's interesting to note that obesity was uncommon on the frontier. The combination of frequent hard effort, little sugar intake, and low food supply, keeping the majority of individuals in shape. But this thinness wasn't always a good thing. Many people on the frontier suffered from malnourishment even if they were eating enough to keep going. Beyond necessities for survival like as food, families with young children had particular difficulties in frontier life. Had you been born within your early years would have been very different from today's if you had gone to the Wild West instead of merely visiting it. Encounters. The 19th century saw a distinct conception of childhood. Youngsters as young as 6 or 7 were supposed to perform important tasks for the survival of the family, not as schoolwork, but as necessary. Financial donations. Young children picked, collected eggs, and looked after cattle. Veggies, kept an eye on younger siblings, and performed a myriad of other duties that allowed adults to focus on more difficult jobs. Most frontier children worked alongside adults at almost adult levels by the time they were 10 or 12. Ability. Boys learned by following their dads into barns, fields, or workplaces. Abilities through active engagement as opposed to structured training. Working alongside mothers, girls learned that frontier homemaking requires sophisticated domestic abilities, not just basic housekeeping, but the manufacturing of necessities like soap, candles, preserved food, and clothes. This early adulthood encompassed various aspects of existence. The harsh reality of their surroundings were not shielded from children. They saw animal killings, births, and deaths, as well as the occasionally violent disputes that occurred in frontier towns. Instead of being shielded from these realities, they were supposed to comprehend them and adjust to them. Learning as it was scarce and erratic on the frontier, as contemporary people understand it. In well-established communities, schools may only a few months per year, usually in the winter when there was little agricultural labor. One instructor, frequently hardly, schooled oneself and could be in charge of pupils as young as 5 to 17 years old, all in one room, studying. The physical state of these were difficult schools. Due to inadequate insulation, buildings experienced freezing temperatures during the winter and suppressing heat during the warmer months. There weren't many supplies, maybe some were shared. Textbooks, writing slates that required frequent erasure and reuse, and little amount of paper that was valued highly. The typical disciplinary method was corporal punishment, which included beatings or whippings for violations as minor as failing to memorize assigned material or whispering. And further, there may not be any formal education in isolated places. A few families carried out. Many frontier children received just the most basic literacy instruction at home, utilizing whatever books were available, and the ability to calculate. If their schooling had been more practical, understanding how to forecast the weather, monitor animals, prepare planting soil, tend to common injuries, and carry out the innumerable additional survival-related duties, there was still child mortality, devastatingly high during the time of the frontier. About 1 out of 4 children who were at the highest risk during their first 5 years of life passed away before becoming adults. Illnesses that contemporary. It is easy to avoid or treat with drugs. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles. Young children were frequently killed or permanently damaged by whooping cough. Since kid safety was a novel idea in that era, accidents claimed far more lives, where taking risks was necessary for survival. The psychological effects of it is hard for modern people to understand this mortality on both parents and children. The majority of kids grow up observing the deaths of siblings. Parents frequently gave the same since they expected to lose their children. Given to a child born after an elder sibling who passed away at an early age. A method that appears odd now, but it captured the different perspective on mortality in a time when dying was a commonplace occurrence. Presence. The gap between frontier and contemporary life is perhaps best exemplified by approaches to medicine and health. If you got sick or hurt in the West in the 1870s, your experience would hardly resemble contemporary medical treatment. The first distinction is that most places lack access to professional medical care. Circumstances. There were few doctors, and many areas had none at all. Those who did work on the frontier frequently received little instruction, maybe only a few months at a medical school. Their expertise mirrored the medical science of the day, which continued to mostly rely on notions such as humoral balance, which had more prevalent in medieval medicine than in contemporary practice. Without having access to experts' care, traditional medicine and home remedies were used to treat the majority of health conditions. There were people in every village, typically using customs from different civilizations. Ladies are renowned for their ability to heal. A few of these, although many treatments, especially herbal ones, had true therapeutic benefits, many were useless or actively detrimental. During that time, common medical procedures included bloodletting, which made already sick patients weaker, procedures that resulted in serious diarrhea, purportedly to rid the body of harmful humors, and pick uses of different materials that were placed to wounds, some of which caused infection instead of stopping it. The tincture of laudanum, which opium was commonly used to treat pain, and it frequently resulted in addiction. Mercury. Even though the chemicals were hazardous, they were recommended for a variety of illnesses. Even when therapies had some validity, issues were induced by unclean drugs. In the absence of pharmaceutical standards or regulations, the potencies of commercially available medications varied greatly, and they frequently included harmful impurities. Numerous patents. The main ingredient in medications sold as cures was alcohol, which provided short-term intoxication as a kind of relief instead of treating underlying issues. Frontier and surgery. The state of affairs was especially appalling. Without anesthesia that works better than alcohol, whiskey, or opium, patients suffered terrible agony while undergoing operations. There was no sterilization or irregularly carried out, resulting in a high rate of postoperative infections. The norm was amputation. Treatment for severe limb injuries with blades and wounds that may be cleaned, but never adequately sterilized. Giving birth was arguably the most glaring contrast between frontier and contemporary medical encounters. Usually, women gave birth at home, attended by female relatives in the absence of a midwife, assuming one was available. Without prenatal treatment, it was not until labor had begun that difficulties were discovered. Births that are breached, hemorrhage, and other situations that are frequently treated by modern medicine frequently lead to the death of a mother, child, or both. On the border, maternal mortality rates were at 1 death per 1,000, more than 100 times more than in wealthy nations per 100 newborns. Today, many women knew going into each pregnancy that it might be their last. Men's journals and the devastating reality of raising children alone after losing a parent is often mentioned in letters from that era. Spouses giving delivery. The combined effects of poor diet, ongoing physical stress. Frontier communities suffered from poor health outcomes due to a lack of preventive care and antiquated treatment options. More like today's poorer countries than contemporary America. Expectancy of life was younger than 40 at birth, and those who survived childhood were likely to experience. If they lived that long, they would have chronic health issues by their 50s. Beyond these, material hardships, the isolation that came with living on the frontier, and gap that contemporary individuals used to instantaneous worldwide connectivity would find nearly intolerable. Frontier psychology and culture were profoundly impacted by this seclusion. Methods. Communication with friends or family who lived far away happened at the rate of physical conveyance. It took weeks or months for letters to get to their addressee, if, at all, they showed up. News was delayed, untrustworthy, and frequently misrepresented. By recounting, in isolated locations, major events may go unnoticed for months after they happen. A lack of information led to a very limited perspective of the world, making far-off occurrences appear abstract and unimportant in light of the current issues facing the community. The seclusion was very challenging for people who are used to more settled settings. Women who had strong female friendships and family ties as children, while men traveled for work or supplies. Networks frequently found themselves left alone for days or weeks. Their diaries often discussed the psychological toll of not having adult interaction and debilitating loneliness. Long stretches of time. This seclusion occasionally resulted in what modern narratives refer to as prairie madness, extreme sadness, worry, and sometimes even psychosis brought on by the combination of natural challenges, continuous labor, and seclusion. A few, those who were impacted, either killed themselves or started acting violently against family members. Others just gave up their homesteads and went back east because they couldn't handle the mental strain of living on the frontier. Social relationships were constrained even with well-established communities by pragmatic limitations. It could take several miles to see neighbors, which is a big task when time is limited, was valuable, and the only ways to get around were on foot or by horseback. Official social meetings were few and usually focused on community activities, church services, or seasonal festivities, such as harvest festivals or barn raisings. Churches were essential, function in frontier settlements that goes beyond their religious responsibility. They functioned as centers of instruction, social gathering places, and societies of mutual aid. Even those who were not particularly devout frequently attended church services because the link they provide to the community. Priests, ministers, religious leaders, or lay preachers often assumed responsibilities that went much beyond providing religious direction, acting as community organizers, educators, and mediators of conflicts. The creation of significant turning points in the development of the border were marked by community institutions. Constructing a meeting room, church, or school signified a dedication to long-term habitation rather than short-term exploitation. These establishments assisted in converting trading stations or mining camps into towns with shared futures and collective identities. The establishment of local governments, as basic as they frequently were, similarly noticeable shifts from the anarchy of the frontier to a settled society. Additionally, frontier tribes evolved unique means of cooperation and teamwork that were essential to their existence. In difficult circumstances, families were able to finish major construction projects through the rising of barns and houses, not feasible for individual families. Harvest crews traveled from one farm to another, making certain that crops were harvested before the weather destroyed them. When kids went, unplanned search parties were created. Absent, these cooperative customs were a reflection of the pragmatic fact that a person or family could completely subsist on the frontier by independence. Interdependence throughout the community coexisted with the individuality that eventually became mythologized in stories about the frontier. Both components required responses to situations on the boundary. Independence for day-to-day survival and group collaboration for obstacles beyond personal ability. Frontier culture was created by the conflict between these ideals and still has an impact on American views about the government, society, and individual. Accountability. As yet another Wild West day comes to an end, you discover yourself reflecting on the emotional and mental fortitude needed to endure such circumstances year after year. The American frontier's inhabitants were not superhuman. The constant pressure of their surroundings caused them to suffer, struggle, and occasionally break. However, many adjusted and persisted, gaining knowledge and insights that enabled them to find purpose and even happiness in the midst of adversity. The deep calm of the pre-industrial night descends as darkness descends once more around you. The days, experiences have allowed you to see a world that is both completely unfamiliar yet familiar. In a world where surviving, continuous attention to detail, where luxury was practically non-existent and comfort was scarce, when death wasn't a faraway stranger but rather a constant acquaintance. As you sleep approaches, you ponder whether this is a life that individuals have chosen or that circumstances have forced upon them. What motivated them to the West? What kept them going during droughts, blizzards, sickness, and loss? How would they feel about the world that their hardships shaped? A prosperous and safe world outside. Anything they could dream of, constructed on the foundations they created with countless hours of labor and sacrifices. The inquiries continue into dreams that are replete with vast landscapes, majestic mountains, and the faces of the Wild West tamers, not in romantic shootouts, but via the unsung bravery of everyday perseverance in the face of insurmountable challenges. Their tale, devoid of frontier myths and Hollywood glitz, is a monument to human adaptability and the remarkable bravery of common individuals in the face of enormous adversity. Dawn begins to reveal what will be the last day you spent in the Wild West. When the golden light streams over the terrain, you pause to admire the unadulterated beauty that attracted so many people to the West. Despite the risks and despite its struggles, the frontier was a location of breathtaking natural beauty. Huge prairies, canyons descending into the sky, mountains scraping the sky, and oceans rippling. Depths of the earth. At least this beauty wasn't a product of Hollywood. However, even this relationship with nature was very different from how we think about the environment today. The frontier believed that nature was essentially a resource to be subjugated and used for profit, instead than being kept or safeguarded. Regeneration was not taken into account when cutting down the timber. They hunted game to the in many places on the verge of extinction. The streams were rerouted, contaminated, or demolished for mining purposes without considering the effects on downstream communities. The imminence of the perhaps the most striking illustration of this is the American bison buffalo exploitative strategy. There were an estimated 3,060 million bison roaming about in the 1700s. North America, there were less than 1,000 left by 1884. This destruction wasn't just the outcome of hunting. However, that was a contributing factor for food or hides. Additionally, it was intentional strategy promoted by the U.S. government to deprive plains. Depriving Indian tribes of their main source of income, they are compelled to live on reservations. Sheridan, General Philip A. According to reports, a prominent military figure in the Plains Indian Wars said, "Let them kill. Until the buffalo is eradicated, sell its hide. This is the only way to establish enduring peace and permit civilization to progress." Regardless of whether he said these precise words, they faithfully capture the era's government strategy. The buffalo herd's devastation was an environmental warfare intended to destroy Native American country's way of life in order to break their resistance. White settlement growth in the West was seen as apocalyptic, not only because it resulted in physical displacement, but also because it breakdown of spiritual customs, cultural identities, and economic systems connected to particular resources and geographies. Although early contacts can entail collaboration and trade by the most indigenous people faced difficult decisions in the 1870s, including being confined to reserves and continuing to struggle. The reservation system itself was a type of cultural assimilation or cultural assimilation against tremendous odds. During the genocide, Native children were taken from their homes and brought to boarding schools that were intended to kill the Indian and save the man. According to the Carol's inventor, Captain Richard H. Pratt, according to the notorious Indian Industrial School, these kids had their hair shortened, prohibited from using their own tongues, engaging in their religious activities, or preserving their cultural identities. These policies' intergenerational trauma still has an impact on indigenous groups today. Armed opposition to U.S. expansion nearly always resulted in defeat, even though certain factions were able to hold onto their independence for longer than others. In 1876, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, when Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong was beaten by a combined force of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho. One of the final significant Native triumphs was Custer's 8th Cavalry. The ensuing military operations increased violence against these tribes, which included killings of women and attacks on villages. Kids The tragedy of this clash of cultures was compounded by the fact that numerous indigenous cultures had intricate governing frameworks, sophisticated agriculture systems, and abundant cultural customs that would have provided European colonists with insightful information. The various methods for ownership and land use led to basic misconceptions. Numerous indigenous groups couldn't imagine possessing land in the same way that one could possess the heavens or the air, so treaty talks over terrain that was essentially troublesome from the beginning. These disputes between cultures went beyond native-white relations. The West was incredibly varied, with populations from all over the world bringing many languages, faiths, traditions, and methods to the frontier life. This diversity was advantageous since it brought a range of skills and viewpoints and a cause of conflict in areas where infrastructure and resources are limited. Chinese immigrants who were instrumental in the development of mining and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Discrimination against operations was especially harsh. The exclusion of Chinese. The first significant American law limiting immigration was the Act of 1882, which was based on nationalism, which developed from decades-old anti-Chinese prejudice. In areas in the West, Chinese miners were often forced out of profitable claims through unfair taxation of foreign miners or violence. Chinese populations in frontier towns frequently experienced major expulsions and riots. When the state of the economy worsened, Mexican citizens, many of whom had turned into U.S. residents who acquired territory instead of immigrating, also experienced prejudice and displacement. After the Mexican-American War, treaty protections safeguarding property rights were in place, but much Mexican land owners lost their holdings due to open fraud, intimidation, or legal manipulation. Water with Spanish origins. English common law took the role of rights systems that had worked well for generations, methods that are less appropriate for dry climates. Even immigrants from Europe discovered that in the boundary, religious and national identities remained significant. Germans, Irish Catholics, Eastern European Jews, Lutherans, and Protestants from Scandinavia. Every group tended to create unique communities and preserve cultural customs from their homelands. Although these groups supported one another, they occasionally became the focus of Nivist sentiment when there were social or economic conflicts. African Americans who migrated west following the Civil War sought to end Southern oppression, but it frequently ran into various prejudice. Black ranchers, who comprised roughly 25% of the labor force on some cattle operations, were hardly acknowledged in modern cans or mythology from later times. Black homesteaders founded settlements in a number of western regions, but they usually encountered unfair enforcement of homestead rules and coordinated opposition from white neighbors. The clash of these various groups, each with their own customs, beliefs, and standards, made frontier societies much more complicated and tense than those that came after. Romantic portrayals would imply. Both were veiled by the melting pot concept that became prominent in later American mythology. The enduring cultural differences among different tribes and the disparities in power that established whose. Some civilizations would be suppressed while others would be protected. As the day goes on, you discover that you're in a frontier community that is rapidly changing. A shift taking place throughout the West in the 1870s and the 1880s. The early stages of settlement, when independent prospectors, small-scale businesses, and individual farmers were making way for more structured corporate expansion of resources in the West. This change was sparked by the introduction of railroads. This shift from a frontier to an integrated area wasn't just cultural as opposed to economic. Over time, the rough-edged cattle settlement or mining camp gained establishments that indicated stability and ties to the larger community. Churches, schools, and banks, theaters, newspapers, and fraternal groups. When the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, travel times were significantly shortened. From months to days, east to west. Later branch lines made their way through, linking hitherto remote areas to national supply systems and marketplaces. This revolution in transportation permitted the vast production of Eastern commodities and the extensive exploitation of Western resources for Eastern manufacturers to overrun marketplaces in the West. These commercial ties hastened the Western world's integration, regions into national systems, but small producers were frequently at a disadvantage. Large mining companies that introduced funds and industrial procedures made it impossible for independent miners to compete. Investment. Family farms faced competition from large-scale agricultural enterprises. Little cattle firms with political clout and investor support began to squeeze ranchers. Political and economic frameworks were increasingly influenced by corporate interests. Railroads, mining, large landowners, timber interests, and conglomerates all exerted tremendous impact on early state and territory administrations. Mineral rights and water rights, timber concessions, grazing rights, and claims were distributed using procedures that generally favored the wealthy and powerful over small business owners or the community. Interests. Streets were occasionally paved after being inspected. Wooden buildings were replaced by structures made of stone and brick. Local governments created laws governing conduct that had previously left uncontrolled many people who had been drawn to the frontier specifically. These modifications constituted unwanted domestication of the wild due to its freedom from Eastern restrictions. Areas they had looked for. Some kept going west before the others did. Civilization, looking for uncharted territory. Others found it difficult to adjust to rising social expectations, competition, and regulation. The frontier's legendary demise, stated in the census of 1890, represented actual cultural and psychological difficulties for people whose identities were connected to the realities of the frontier. A portion of this change entailed controlling, or at least taming, frontier violence. During a particular historical period, legendary gunfighters and outlaws who would go on to dominate Western mythology were active. When official law enforcement first started to establish itself in opposition to systems of violence, both individual and collective, when the 1880s and 1890s arrived, in the majority of developed communities, vigilante justice had been supplanted by professional police forces and judicial systems, although frontier-style conflicts continued to occasionally arise in distant locations. Resolution. The renowned individuals who captivated the public's attention: Wild Bill, Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, Jesse James, and Hickok all worked in this time, frequently switching between legal and illicit activities as the situation shifted. The complex was veiled by its subsequent mythologization, their lives frequently morally dubious realities. Hickok is far from ideal. Legendary marksman who engaged in at least 2 gunfights and shot bystanders. Earp was employed. Throughout his career, he worked as a vigilante, a gambler, a law enforcement officer, and a brothel keeper. The picture of Robin Hood that is connected to Jesse James disregarded the innocent people he had robbed and his history as a Confederate guerrilla. As dusk draws near, You're thinking about the contrast between frontier realities and the Wild West on your last day there. Mythos that would subsequently come out of it. Why did Americans, and ultimately the world, became enthralled with a romanticized portrayal of this vicious time frame? What truths and needs did these tales fulfill? Obscure? Timing is part of the solution. The most intense time frame of the creation of frontier mythology happened at the exact moment that the frontier itself was vanishing. The Wild West displays. In the 1880s, Buffalo Bill Cody started performing theatrical reenactments of Indian conflicts and robberies of stagecoaches for audiences in the East, despite railroads. Western territories were being incorporated into mainstream American society through formal governance and telegraph lines. These performances were intended as entertainment that spoke to audiences rather than as faithful historical reenactments. Eastern perspectives on the West. The popular dime books that made exaggerated Western hero stories were first published in Eastern publishing houses by writers who were not from the frontier, hardly ever visited the areas they described firsthand. These formulaic action was stressed in stories, and heroes and villains were morally distinct, and an idea of the West as a place where American values of independence, bravery, and independence. Hollywood Westerns subsequently enhanced and magnified these mystical components, producing recognizable pictures of lone cowboys, valiant sheriffs, and evil, wild Indians and outlaws who didn't really resemble historical figures. These movies served cultural and psychological purposes that go beyond amusement. They provided comforting stories about Americans' identity throughout times of global crises and swift social change. According to the legend, frontier life had shaped American character, creating remarkable traits that set them apart. The country from more traditional societies. It suggested that the United States continental expansion had not only unavoidable but ethically acceptable, a victory of civilization over the wild, an advance past archaic cultures. Simplified moral frameworks were presented, whereby noble violence was always used to defeat evil, defending America's increasing economic and military might in the international arena. These myths hid the nuanced, ethically dubious reality of Western progress, indigenous peoples' genocide, the exploitation of labor of immigrants, environmental destruction, corporate influence on government systems, and the very divided community grappling with basic issues of resources, government, and identity. The Authentic West provided a case study of how human societies adjust to difficult situations rather than straightforward moral teachings. Circumstances, occasionally displaying exceptional collaboration and inventiveness, occasionally devolving into exploitation and cruelty. As night falls again, you consider your short journey through the Wild West, unromanticized. You've personally witnessed why the typical individual nowadays, used to having access to plenty of food, healthcare, and physical safety, plus a host of other conveniences that frontier people would not be able to enjoy for even a day in the real circumstances on the frontier in the 1870s. The abilities, expertise, physical training, and mental the fortitude needed to survive on the frontier is a manner of life that is so removed from contemporary reality as to be almost unthinkable. Still, there is something about this universe that fascinates us. Maybe it's the unvarnished truth of a life reduced to its most basic necessities, where chores yield instant results and accomplishments represent actual accomplishments against natural restrictions. Perhaps it's the community interdependence that arose from similar problems, forging connections that transcended differences in origin or conviction. Perhaps it's merely the reminder that human beings may endure and even find purpose in conditions significantly tougher than most of us would ever endure. The American frontier's legacy goes beyond mythology into the real-world institutions and frameworks that influence contemporary American society. Frameworks for water rights, federal-state relations, property laws, and strategies. Compromises made during the frontier era gave rise to natural resources and numerous other facets of American governance. And disputes. Despite attempts at forced integration, the diversity of Western communities played a role in America's multicultural reality today. Even the ongoing conflicts between collective rights and individual. The frontier age is the origin of welfare, local control, and national norms, exploitation, and conservation. Discussions. Indigenous peoples do not view the frontier era as a time of great prosperity, chapter in the country's growth, but the destruction of traditional lifeways and the start of an ongoing, protracted fight for cultural survival and sovereignty. Their perspective serves as a reminder that the straightforward, triumphalist account of Western settlement overlooks the intricate pre-existing civilizations and the immeasurable knowledge that was lost as a result of their upheaval. The majority of having a variety of viewpoints is necessary for a thorough grasp of the frontier. At the same time, recognizing the bravery of people who established new communities under difficult circumstances, and the destruction endured by individuals who were uprooted by this growth. As you are surrounded by the sounds of this previous America as you go off to sleep on your last night in the Wild West. A wind whispering through the grassland grass. The howl of coyotes in the distance. Maybe the faint piano music coming from a nearby saloon. These sensory encounters at least related to everyone who experienced this time period. Whatever one's circumstances or background, the wide skies, intense weather, majestic scenery, and deep silences molded everyone who met them, establishing a common bond with the environment despite cultural disputes. You'll return to your own time tomorrow with a more profound comprehension of this crucial era of American history. You will never again read a frontier fiction or watch a Western without appreciating the simplistic, sanitized representation of a complicated reality. You'll value the incredible modern luxury and security made possible by unthinkable technical advancements. Inhabitants of the boundary, you may become more conscious of the abilities and information lost as our civilization became more reliant on specialized technologies. The pragmatic independence that made it possible for frontier people to construct, fix, develop, maintain, and produce what they required with little outside assistance. Above all, you'll realize that the American West's true tale lies not in gold strikes and gunfights, but rather in the everyday hardships of common people, including men, women, and kids from a variety of backgrounds who had to deal with extraordinary difficulties with the few resources at their disposal. Their narrative sands. Hollywood glitz has enough real bravery, sorrow, and creativity. Innumerable history are filled with strife, cooperation, cruelty, and kindness. The settlements they founded, the environmental improvements they brought about, and the myths that developed from their experiences, as well as the patterns they established. The true Wild West vanished ages ago due to population growth and technological advancements. Expansion, environmental change, and economic integration into the contemporary American West of cities, suburbs, roads as well as cultivated landscapes. However, remnants of the frontier experience continue to exist throughout. Regional identities, customs, patterns of land usage, and systems of government. The recollection of this formative. Americans' perceptions of themselves and the progress of their country are still influenced by this time period. Even though communities and academics want to replace oversimplified myths with more precise, comprehensive interpretations of this intricate past, when you ultimately give up to, the line between the past and present appears to blur while you sleep. The difficulties that frontier settlements encounter. Changing, addressing environmental limitations, resource management, and the construction of functional communities among various demographics, striking a balance between personal liberty and communal needs, which are still relevant today in fresh ways. Possibly the most significant legacy of the frontier experience is a series of inquiries concerning human adaptation rather than a list of solutions. The development of communities and the interaction between humans and the environment. Every generation is questioned, must provide a different response when the situation evolves. The stars are dazzling. Above, the same stars that helped farmers time their plantings, led visitors across the plains, and provided consolation to immigrants who are homesick. Distant vistas. At this time of, you have a brief sense of kinship with people who gazed upon these identical constellations a century ago and a half ago, speculating about what the future held in a world where survival was never assured, but existence in general. Its beauty and roughness were felt with a depth that is rarely found in our more cozy time period. Finally, sleep arrives, bringing with it visions of the West, both ruthless and mighty. A location where human resiliency and vulnerability were demonstrated in equal measure, where various peoples came into contact and occasionally worked together to create a country where the day-to-day battle for survival included moments of sublime relationship with magnificent scenery. The actual wild, devoid of romantic pretense, the West provides a glimpse into the human condition at its most basic, difficult, terrifying, and sometimes wonderful.